It always starts small, too small. The kind of detail you could brush off with a shrug, but later, looking back, you realize it was the first crack in the foundation. That's the thing about neighborhood drama. No one ever knows the war has begun until the letters start piling up. This particular neighborhood was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to pretend their lives were perfectly curated. White fences, perfect lawns, a cul-de-sac where every car was washed twice a week and the trash bins were lined up with military precision. The Homeowners Association wasn't just an organization, it was practically a religion. And if you weren't devout, well, you'd find out soon enough. The mailboxes stood like little soldiers along the curb, identical black boxes with shiny silver flags. They were ordinary, nothing fancy, but in this neighborhood, they were more than mail receptacles. They were symbols. They represented compliance, order, and the illusion that everyone was living the same perfect suburban dream. The HOA loved uniformity, and uniformity loved them back. For months, life hummed along without interruption. Neighbors waved politely, sprinklers clicked on and off at the exact same times every morning. The mail arrived like clockwork, delivering the usual: bills, coupons, magazines no one ordered. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, nothing to suggest that these mailboxes would soon become the battleground for one of the pettiest, most outrageous wars the cul-de-sac had ever seen. It began with one letter. Not a letter from the bank or the electric company, but one written on thick, creamy stationery with looping, overconfident handwriting. It had no return address, but everyone could tell it was written by someone who fancied themselves a gatekeeper of neighborhood morality. The contents? Oh, nothing life-shattering, just a passive-aggressive note slipped into one unlucky neighbor's mailbox, criticizing the color of their front door. Yes, you heard that right, the door. Apparently, a muted shade of sage green was enough to disturb the fragile ecosystem of suburban conformity. And instead of handling it like an adult, like, say, ringing the doorbell and saying, "Hey, maybe your door violates HOA guidelines," someone decided to weaponize the written word. Now, in any normal place, this would have been a one-off, a weird little note tossed in the trash, laughed about over dinner. But not here, not in this cul-de-sac. Here, a note was never just a note. It was the opening shot in a campaign, the spark to a fire that would rage until every single neighbor was choking on the smoke. The recipient of the letter didn't stay quiet. Oh no, they doubled down. They wrote their own note, longer, nastier, dripping with sarcasm, and stuffed it right back into the mailbox of the suspected culprit. And that, dear listener, was the exact moment things spiraled out of control. Because once one neighbor retaliated, others got ideas. And once others got ideas, the whole street became a flurry of anonymous letters, each one more absurd, more cutting, and more unnecessary than the last. At first, it was about little things: lawn care, garbage cans left out too long, Christmas lights hung 1 week too early. But soon, the notes grew personal. They targeted parenting styles, driving habits, even the quality of someone's store-bought cookies at the last HOA bake sale. The level of pettiness was Olympic, gold medal worthy. And through it all, the mailboxes suffered the most. Day after day, they were stuffed with folded sheets of hostility, becoming unwilling couriers of neighborhood warfare. What had once been simple containers for bills and junk mail were now the front lines of a battle no one officially acknowledged, but everyone participated in. Of course, the HOA caught wind of it. They always do. And when the HOA gets involved, you know the drama is about to mutate into something even more absurd. But in this case, the HOA wasn't swooping in to stop the chaos. No, some of the letters were traced back to the HOA board members themselves. The very people meant to keep order were pouring gasoline on the fire. By the time the first month of this letter war passed, the cul-de-sac had transformed. Neighbors no longer waved. They glared. They whispered. They peeked through blinds and counted how many envelopes were slipped into whose mailbox. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, as if a crime had been committed, and everyone was both a detective and a suspect. And yet, this was only the beginning. The letters weren't just snide remarks anymore. They were escalating. Anonymous threats about reporting violations, photocopies of rule books with sections highlighted in neon yellow, even printouts of blurry security camera stills, accusing people of crimes as small as letting their dog pee too close to the sidewalk. The neighborhood, once peaceful, was now simmering. And like any simmering pot left unattended, it was only a matter of time before it boiled over, splattering everyone in reach. The first actual confrontation was about to happen, not with fists, not with shouting in the street, but with something far pettier, something that would take this drama from simple mail slot gossip to full-blown suburban warfare. And it all started with a mailbox.
The first real escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was quiet, subtle, and far more disturbing than any screaming match could ever be. Because one morning, in the middle of the week, as sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns and garage doors hummed open for the daily commute, a neighbor walked out to check their mail and found nothing. No bills, no coupons, no HOA newsletters. Just an empty box. At first, they thought maybe the mailman hadn't come yet. But the rest of the street? Their boxes were full. And so began the rumors of mailbox sabotage. Of course, in any sane neighborhood, this would be dismissed as a fluke. Maybe the post office messed up. Maybe the carrier skipped a house. But remember, this wasn't a sane neighborhood. This was a cul-de-sac already marinating in suspicion and paranoia. The idea that someone had physically tampered with another person's mailbox wasn't just possible, it was probable. Within days, the stories multiplied. Envelopes disappearing, packages going missing, letters reappearing in the wrong mailboxes already opened, as if someone had been snooping. It was no longer just about notes slipped in with petty complaints. It was about trust, or rather, the complete collapse of it. The HOA tried to hold a meeting about it, but if you think that solved anything, you clearly don't know how these people operated. The board members themselves were under suspicion, and when the fox is accused of raiding the hen house, the hens don't exactly feel reassured by a pep talk. All the meeting accomplished was a lot of crossed arms, a lot of side eyes, and one particularly dramatic exit when a neighbor stormed out after being accused of mail tampering in front of everyone. And the mailboxes? Oh, they were no longer neutral ground. They became targets. Some neighbors started adding locks to theirs, ugly padlocks that stood out like sore thumbs against the mandated uniform black paint. Others installed cameras pointing directly at the curb, capturing hours of footage of absolutely nothing, except the occasional dog walker who now found themselves the subject of intense online speculation. But the most creative act of defiance came from one resident who decided to reinforce their mailbox entirely. They swapped out the standard model for something sturdier, bulkier, practically indestructible. A mailbox built like a fortress. And you can guess how well that went over with the HOA. Letters of complaint were issued. Ironic, considering letters were the whole reason this drama existed in the first place. The upgraded mailbox was deemed non-compliant, and fines were threatened. But instead of caving, the homeowner fought back. They claimed the HOA had failed to protect them from vandalism and theft, and therefore they had every right to defend their own property. It was the kind of circular argument that could go on forever. And, spoiler alert, it did. Meanwhile, the anonymous letters continued, growing nastier with each delivery. Someone was writing about cars parked slightly over the line. Someone else complained that kids were leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Another letter, dripping with faux concern, warned a neighbor that their choice of garden gnome was disturbing the aesthetic balance of the street. Yes, the garden gnome was now public enemy number one. And the worst part? Nobody could prove who was writing them. People suspected the HOA president, the vice president, the nosy lady on the corner who always seemed to know everyone's business. But the anonymity gave the culprit, or culprits, immense power. They could poison relationships without ever revealing themselves. And the more the letters spread, the more everyone distrusted each other. The atmosphere grew toxic. Neighbors stopped speaking altogether. Garage doors opened and closed like drawbridges, sealing people in their castles. Even kids stopped playing outside because their parents were convinced that the mailbox stalker was lurking nearby. A once picturesque cul-de-sac now looked like a row of fortresses preparing for siege. Then came the incident that turned everything from petty suspicion into all-out war. One night, under the cover of darkness, someone filled a neighbor's mailbox with shredded junk mail. Not just a handful, but enough to spill out when the door opened, scattering across the driveway like confetti at a very unfriendly parade. It was petty, it was ridiculous, but it was also a declaration. This wasn't about quiet notes anymore. It was sabotage. A prank, yes, but one designed to humiliate. And humiliate it did. By sunrise, the whole street knew about it, and the victim was demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, and practically foaming at the mouth on their perfectly edged lawn. Of course, no one confessed. No one ever does. And so the neighborhood fell even deeper into chaos. Locks were doubled. Security cameras multiplied. One neighbor even claimed they'd caught a shadowy figure on film, though when the footage circulated, it turned out to be nothing more than a raccoon. That didn't stop the conspiracy theories, though. And here's the kicker. In the middle of all this, the actual mail delivery was falling apart. The post office was sick of complaints. The carrier hated the route, and sometimes entire bundles of mail were delayed. But instead of blaming the system, the neighbors blamed each other. Every missing water bill was a theft. Every late magazine was sabotage. Every coupon booklet was part of the conspiracy. The cul-de-sac was eating itself alive, one envelope at a time. And the worst was still ahead. Because soon, the mailbox drama wouldn't just be about paper and ink. It would escalate into property destruction, police involvement, and, believe it or not, an emergency HOA election. All because of a few letters.
By the time the shredded junk mail incident had run its course, the neighborhood had officially crossed a line. It wasn't just passive-aggressive notes anymore, it was vandalism. And once you hit vandalism, you know what happens next. Someone, inevitably, calls the cops. Now, to be fair, it wasn't like a SWAT team rolled up. It was just one tired patrol officer, clearly annoyed to be wasting his morning on a cul-de-sac full of overgrown children. He stood there, hands on his belt, staring at the pile of shredded paper as if waiting for it to spontaneously confess. Meanwhile, the victim neighbor went on and on about mail fraud, federal crimes, and neighborhood terrorism. Yes, terrorism over junk mail. The officer took some notes, nodded a lot, and finally explained, very patiently, that unless someone actually stole government-delivered mail, there wasn't much he could do. But that wasn't what the neighbors heard. No, what they heard was, this is a federal case. And if there's one thing suburban drama thrives on, it's the illusion of importance. Within a week, everyone was throwing around legal terms they'd half heard on crime shows. Tampering, fraud, federal offense. Never mind that most of them didn't actually know what those words meant. The narrative had already solidified. The mailbox war was now officially a matter of law enforcement. And nothing fuels paranoia like the whiff of a federal investigation. Of course, the HOA couldn't resist inserting themselves deeper into the mess. The president sent out a mass email titled Mailbox Mayhem, Our Community at Risk. It read like a manifesto, filled with vague threats about security measures, fines, and the importance of restoring order. It was equal parts laughable and terrifying, especially when rumors started circulating that the board was considering hiring private security. Yes, private security for a cul-de-sac of 14 houses. And the neighbors? They doubled down on the madness. Motion sensor lights popped up everywhere. Cameras sprouted like weeds, each one pointed at a different angle of the street, turning the once charming block into a low-budget reality show set. People started keeping logs. Yes, actual written logs of who walked by their mailboxes, at what time, and for how long. It would have been funny if it weren't so disturbing. Well, actually, it was kind of funny. But then came the night of the firecrackers. Someone, still anonymous, stuffed a handful of small fireworks into a mailbox and lit the fuse. It wasn't enough to cause damage, just a loud bang that woke up half the street and left scorch marks on the metal. But it was enough to escalate the war into a whole new territory. Suddenly, this wasn't just about shredded mail or sarcastic notes. This was dangerous. And that meant the police came back. This time, they weren't just rolling their eyes. They were serious. They warned that messing with mailboxes was, in fact, a crime, and whoever was responsible could face real charges. They even suggested neighbors take turns monitoring the street at night to deter further incidents, which naturally was the worst possible advice. Because give a group of suspicious, self-righteous neighbors permission to patrol their own street, and you've basically handed them a license for chaos. And chaos is exactly what followed. Within days, the cul-de-sac transformed into a bizarre suburban neighborhood watch nightmare. Neighbors prowled the sidewalks in reflective vests, armed with flashlights and notebooks, glaring suspiciously at anyone daring to take a late-night walk. One man even bought a pair of binoculars, as if mailbox criminals were perching in trees like rare birds. And because no good drama stays contained, the patrols became an issue themselves. One neighbor accused another of harassment for being followed too closely during a midnight dog walk. Someone else claimed the watch groups were just a cover for spying. And of course, the HOA tried to regulate it, demanding that patrol schedules be approved by the board, which went over about as well as you'd expect. The letter writing didn't stop either. If anything, it flourished. Notes began referencing the police visits, mocking certain neighbors for crying to the cops. Others hinted at knowing who the mailbox bomber was without ever naming names. Each letter was like a match tossed into a room full of gasoline. And the neighbors kept reading them, kept reacting, kept spiraling further into the abyss. And then came the night that proved the cul-de-sac had lost all sense of proportion. Because one resident, fed up with the endless patrols, the letters, and the paranoia, decided to take matters into their own hands. They set up a fake mailbox. That's right, a decoy. A brand new, shiny black box placed right next to the original, but wired with a motion-activated alarm. The idea was simple: catch the culprit in the act. But the reality was pure chaos. Because the alarm went off in the middle of the night, blaring like a car horn, waking up the entire neighborhood. Lights flicked on, people ran outside in their pajamas, and within minutes, half the street was screaming accusations at each other, while the other half was filming it on their phones. The culprit? No one. The alarm had been triggered by a cat. But the damage was done. Trust was shattered beyond repair. The neighbors weren't just suspicious anymore. They were openly hostile. And once hostility becomes the default, it's only a matter of time before the real damage begins. The cul-de-sac was now a battlefield. Mailboxes weren't just mailboxes anymore. They were weapons, traps, and targets. And the next move in this ridiculous war, it was going to be bigger, pettier, and louder than anything before. Because someone, somewhere, had decided they weren't just going to write letters anymore.
They were going to expose their enemies publicly. And that's when the HOA election got dragged into the madness.
If the police visits and the exploding mailboxes weren't enough to tear the cul-de-sac apart, the HOA election certainly would be. Normally, HOA elections were boring affairs. Half the neighborhood didn't even show up, and the ones who did only came for the free coffee and Costco muffins. But this year? Oh, this year was different. This year, the mailbox war had turned the election into a battlefield. The HOA president, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood order, had been smugly confident in their re-election. After all, they had presided over the community for years, enforcing rules with the same zeal usually reserved for medieval inquisitors. But now, whispers were spreading. Whispers that the president themselves had been the one penning anonymous letters, slipping them into mailboxes under cover of darkness. Whispers that the great protector of the neighborhood aesthetic was secretly the instigator of its downfall. And when suburban whispers turn into rumors, rumors turn into campaigns. Flyers started appearing, ironically stuffed into mailboxes, denouncing the president. Not officially signed, of course, just dramatic bullet points in bold font, accusing the board of corruption, negligence, and failing to protect the community from ongoing acts of sabotage. Some even went as far as to call for a total restructuring of the HOA board, as if this cul-de-sac were staging a miniature revolution. The president fought back the only way they knew how, with more rules. Emergency bylaws were proposed, special meetings were called, and at one particularly infamous gathering, the president actually waved around a thick binder of regulations like it was holy scripture, insisting that only they had the experience to keep the community from collapsing into chaos. The binder was slammed shut so hard it echoed across the room. Subtlety was not their strong suit. But the neighbors weren't buying it. The mailbox drama had hardened them. They were tired of being told to line up their trash bins perfectly, tired of fines for invisible weeds, tired of surveillance cameras catching them breathing too close to the HOA's precious flower beds. And so, one name began circulating: a challenger. The challenger wasn't anyone special, just a resident with enough free time and enough pent-up frustration to throw their hat into the ring. But in this environment, they became a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of sticking it to the system, and most importantly, a symbol of finally ending the ridiculous war that had consumed their mailboxes, their lawns, and their sanity. The election campaign turned the neighborhood into a circus. Yard signs popped up overnight. Neighbors exchanged not-so-subtle glares depending on which candidate they supported. Facebook groups exploded with accusations, screenshots, and evidence of mail tampering, some of which looked suspiciously photoshopped. And the letters? Oh, the letters evolved. No longer were they just petty complaints. They became political manifestos. Anonymous notes endorsing one candidate, trashing the other, warning of dire consequences if the wrong person was elected. Some letters were so over the top they bordered on parody, accusing candidates of everything from tax fraud to being responsible for the raccoon infestation. Because yes, apparently, the raccoon now had a starring role in the narrative. By the time Election Day arrived, the cul-de-sac was in full meltdown. Ballots were distributed, neighbors filed into the community center, and the atmosphere was more hostile than a courtroom drama. People whispered as they marked their choices, eyes darting suspiciously to make sure no one was peeking. Some even accused others of trying to stuff the ballot box, as if this was a national election and not just a power grab over mailbox aesthetics. And when the results were announced, chaos erupted. The challenger had won. Barely. By 2 votes. And you'd think this would be the end, right? The community finally ousted their tyrannical president, a new dawn for the cul-de-sac. Cue the swelling music, the slow clap, the restoration of peace. But no, because the president didn't go quietly. They declared the election invalid, claiming ballot fraud. They demanded a recount. They even hinted at taking the matter to court. And as if that weren't enough, they accused the new president-elect of orchestrating the mailbox sabotage in the first place as a smear campaign. Yes, you heard that right. The losing candidate's theory, was that the mailbox war had been one giant conspiracy to unseat them from power. And somehow, some neighbors believed it. Suddenly, the community wasn't just divided between mailbox victims and mailbox suspects. It was divided into political factions: pro-president, pro-challenger, undecided but paranoid. The cul-de-sac was now a miniature civil war with propaganda, conspiracies, and more shredded mail than ever before. And then came the twist no one expected: evidence. Because one neighbor, in their obsessive surveillance, actually caught something. A grainy, late-night clip of a figure approaching a mailbox, slipping something inside, and running off. The footage was shaky, blurry, and could have been anyone. But in this cul-de-sac, blurry footage wasn't a limitation. It was an opportunity. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Accusations flew. Neighbors swore they recognized the figure's walk, their hairstyle, even the way they held their flashlight. Some said it was the ousted president. Others said it was the new president-elect. A few even claimed it was staged. But no matter what, one thing was clear: the war wasn't over. It was only getting worse. Because now the neighborhood had something even more dangerous than anonymous letters. They had evidence.
The thing about evidence is this: it doesn't have to be clear, it just has to exist. And in this cul-de-sac, the blurry, low-resolution clip of a shadowy figure at a mailbox was like tossing raw meat into a pit of hungry lions. The video, captured by one neighbor's overzealous security camera, was barely legible. The timestamp flickered, the figure was cloaked in shadows, and the whole thing shook every time the wind blew. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the community finally had something to fight over, something new to pour their paranoia into. Within minutes of its release, neighbors were pausing, zooming, rewinding, and dissecting the footage like amateur CSI investigators. They scrutinized the grainy outline of the person's shoes, the tilt of their head, even the way their elbow bent as they dropped the mysterious envelope into the box. And of course, everyone had their own theory. To one faction, it was undeniably the ousted president, sneaking around to frame their opponents. To another, it was clearly the newly elected president, desperate to maintain power by continuing the chaos. A third group swore it was neither, insisting the figure was taller, thinner, possibly even a teenager from outside the neighborhood. And then there was the fourth camp, the ones who claimed the entire video was staged, a hoax designed to prolong the drama. Naturally, the HOA board demanded answers. The new president called for an emergency review of the evidence, which basically meant a bunch of adults crowding around a laptop screen in someone's living room, squinting at pixels while arguing in circles. The phrase digital enhancement was thrown around more than once, as if anyone in the room had access to forensic-level technology. Spoiler, they didn't. And while the board bickered, the residents escalated. Neighbors printed still frames from the footage and taped them to light poles like wanted posters, scrawling captions like, "Is this the mailbox bandit?" Others formed theories so elaborate they resembled conspiracy charts, complete with red string connecting blurry shapes to real-life suspects. Facebook groups turned into battlefields, with people accusing each other of covering up the truth and threatening to call the FBI. Yes, the FBI. For a mailbox mystery. And through it all, the anonymous letters didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. Some mocked the footage directly, calling it amateur hour. Others referenced details in the video that only the culprit would know, like the exact mailbox number or the time of night. Each new letter was treated like a confession, and every confession pointed in a different direction. Paranoia spread like wildfire. One neighbor swore they recognized the hoodie in the video and accused a teenage son across the street. Another insisted the culprit had the same limp as the man 2 houses down. It didn't matter that half these details were imagined. The damage was done. Every person on the block was a suspect now, and trust wasn't just gone, it was obliterated. Then came the door-to-door interrogations. Armed with clipboards and printouts of the footage, self-appointed concerned citizens marched from house to house demanding alibis. Where were you at 11:37 p.m. last Tuesday night? Did you own shoes that looked like those shoes? Could you prove it? Some neighbors laughed it off, others slammed the door, but a few actually panicked, realizing they had no way to prove they weren't the figure in the video. Of course, the police were dragged back into it again. When shown the video, the officer sighed, said it was inconclusive, and gently suggested everyone stop playing detective. Naturally, the neighbors interpreted that as a cover-up. Now even the local police were in on it. The tension was unbearable. Families stopped hosting barbecues, kids weren't allowed outside after dark, packages piled up at the post office because no one trusted their mailboxes anymore. The cul-de-sac, once a picture-perfect example of suburban pride, now looked more like a paranoid bunker community preparing for an apocalypse. And then the unthinkable happened. One morning, several neighbors awoke to find their mailboxes spray-painted with giant red letters, "Liar." Not one mailbox, not two, almost half the street. It was a coordinated attack, and it was personal. The paint dripped down the black boxes like a scarlet accusation, impossible to ignore. The neighborhood exploded. People were screaming in the street, pointing fingers, threatening lawsuits. The HOA board members tried to calm the crowd, but their own boxes had been vandalized too. And the anonymous vetters? Oh, they doubled down, with one delivered that very afternoon, a typed, bold font message declaring, "This is just the beginning." At this point, the drama was no longer about aesthetics or compliance. It wasn't even about the mail. It was about power, control, dominance. The cul-de-sac wasn't just at war, it was collapsing into madness. And the worst part? The vandalism meant money. Someone had to pay to replace or repaint those mailboxes, and the HOA wasn't about to foot the bill. They blamed the homeowners. The homeowners blamed the HOA. And as the arguments over money piled on top of the arguments over sabotage, the stage was set for the ugliest chapter yet. Because what happens when you mix paranoia, vandalism, and money disputes? That's right, lawsuits.
It was only a matter of time. You can vandalize mailboxes, you can scream in the street, you can even wake people up with false alarms at 2 in the morning. But the second money enters the equation, suburban drama always takes the same predictable turn, straight to the courthouse. The spray-painted liar fiasco had left half the cul-de-sac demanding financial compensation. Repainting or replacing the boxes wasn't cheap, especially when the HOA insisted everything had to be uniform, regulation-approved, and aesthetically compliant. Translation? No quick DIY fixes. Every single vandalized box had to be swapped out with the same expensive HOA-approved model. The homeowners, naturally, balked. Why should they pay for damages when the HOA had clearly failed to protect them? The HOA, just as naturally, refused to take responsibility. Their logic was simple. The mailboxes were on individual property, not common ground. If someone vandalized your box, that was your problem. But don't you dare replace it with the wrong style, or you'd be fined on top of it. And so the lawsuits began. One homeowner filed a claim against the HOA for negligence. Another sued their neighbor directly, claiming the spray paint job looked suspiciously like their handwriting. Yes, handwriting on spray paint. It didn't matter that the paint came from a can, the theory stuck, and so did the lawsuit. Within weeks, legal papers were flying faster than the anonymous letters ever had. Every trip to the mailbox now came with the risk of finding not just bills or threats, but an actual court summons. Some neighbors hired lawyers. Others decided to represent themselves, which led to rants in court about systematic harassment and psychological damages from letter-induced stress. Judges tried to keep straight faces, but the absurdity was impossible to ignore. And the costs were staggering. Legal fees piled up, HOA dues skyrocketed as the board claimed they needed funds to cover their own defense. The irony was delicious. The very people suing the HOA were now funding the HOA's legal team through mandatory payments. Nothing fueled resentment quite like paying for the privilege of being fought in court. Meanwhile, the letters didn't stop. In fact, they got bolder. Some were written on legal letterhead templates mocking the court battles. Others listed court case numbers, taunting neighbors to check the docket. One even came stapled to a fake invoice, billing a resident for defamation of character. Whoever the culprit was, they had a gift for theatrics. And if the lawsuits weren't enough, the courtroom drama spilled into everyday life. Neighbors started serving each other paperwork in the middle of block parties. Depositions were scheduled in living rooms. Even children weren't spared. One parent claimed their kid had been psychologically traumatized by the mailbox chaos and threatened to sue anyone who denied it. The cul-de-sac was no longer a neighborhood. It was a battleground, with lawyers as generals and subpoenas as weapons. Garage doors opened to reveal not cars, but file boxes stacked with evidence. Doorbell cameras were subpoenaed. Security footage was demanded. Even the grainy raccoon video resurfaced, this time presented as suspicious nocturnal activity. The HOA, meanwhile, floundered. Their emergency meetings devolved into shouting matches, with board members turning on each other. Some resigned under pressure, others clung to their positions like lifeboats on a sinking ship. And through it all, the new president, once hailed as the savior of the community, was drowning in lawsuits, accused of everything from mismanagement to outright conspiracy. The neighborhood had become infamous. Local news stations picked up the story, dubbing it the Mailbox Mayhem community. Reporters camped at the entrance, hoping to catch footage of angry residents storming HOA meetings. And they got it, plenty of it. Clips of screaming matches, tearful rants about ruined property values, and one particularly viral moment where a resident dramatically pointed at the camera and shouted, "This is a federal case!" Property values did, in fact, plummet. Realtors avoided the area like it was cursed. Houses sat on the market unsold, while gossip spread faster than the for sale signs could be hammered into lawns. The perfect suburban dream had turned into a nightmare, and no one could escape it. And yet the war wasn't over, because just when it seemed the lawsuits had reached peak absurdity, the culprit, or culprits, made their boldest move yet. One morning, every single resident found the same letter in their mailbox. It was typed, precise, and chilling in its simplicity. You dragged this into court. You dragged this onto the news. But you still don't know who I am. And soon, you'll wish you never started looking. The neighborhood froze. All the lawsuits, the security cameras, the nightly patrols, none of it mattered. The enemy was still out there, watching, waiting, laughing at the chaos they'd created. And the stage was set for the final act of the war. Because once threats turn personal, once fear outweighs pettiness, the conflict doesn't just simmer, it explodes.
The neighborhood had reached the point of no return. What began as a single passive-aggressive note had snowballed into a war of letters, vandalism, lawsuits, and local news coverage. And now with that ominous type threat, "You'll wish you never started looking," the tension was unbearable. Everyone suspected everyone. Garage doors slammed shut like steel vaults. Security cameras multiplied until the cul-de-sac looked like a prison yard. Neighbors avoided eye contact, clutching their mail like evidence in a crime scene. The community wasn't just divided, it was poisoned. And then came the night of the explosion. It wasn't a bomb, at least not in the Hollywood sense, but one of the mailboxes was rigged with a firecracker contraption far bigger than anything seen before. At precisely 10:47 p.m., the thing detonated, sending sparks and shredded letters flying across the street. The sound echoed down the block like a cannon blast, and within seconds, residents were spilling out of their houses in pajamas, clutching phones, convinced their war had just turned deadly. The mailbox was destroyed, blackened, twisted metal hanging off its post like a broken limb. And on the ground, amid the ashes, lay a single, pristine envelope. Inside, one sentence: "This is how it ends." The police arrived. Again. This time,
It wasn't just one tired officer. There were multiple cruisers, flashing lights bouncing off the carefully manicured lawns. Statements were taken, footage reviewed, warnings issued. And though no one was arrested, the message was clear. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was a crime scene. The HOA panicked. Emergency emails were fired off at 2 a.m., demanding compliance, curfews, and heightened vigilance. The new president called for yet another emergency meeting, which turned into a circus of shouting, accusations, and one dramatic fainting spell that required paramedics. Property values, already tanking, now flatlined. The neighborhood was officially toxic real estate. But the final unraveling didn't come from police or lawyers or even another explosion. It came from the mail carrier. Yes, the humble postal worker, long ignored, long overworked, long fed up, finally snapped after months of complaints, lawsuits, and paranoia. They marched into the community center during a heated HOA meeting, dropped a stack of envelopes on the table, and declared that they were done. Done delivering mail to this cul-de-sac. Done dealing with screaming homeowners accusing them of theft. Done playing unwilling referee in a war of suburban egos. Effective immediately, all mail service to the street would be suspended. Residents would have to pick up their letters at the post office. The room went silent. For the first time in months, no one had anything to say. No accusations, no finger-pointing, just stunned realization. The war had ended, not with a victory, not with justice, but with surrender. The mailboxes, once the pride of the cul-de-sac, now stood empty and useless, monuments to the stupidity of their owners. In the weeks that followed, the lawsuits fizzled out. The HOA fractured beyond repair. Several families sold their homes at a loss, unable to stomach the notoriety. Others stayed, clinging to the bitter memory of what their neighborhood once was. The new president resigned. The old president disappeared from public life. And the mailboxes, they were replaced, one by one, until the street looked orderly again, at least on the surface. But no one forgot. Not the residents, not the post office, not the wider community who had gleefully watched the drama unfold on the news. The name stuck. This was no longer Maplewood Court or whatever idyllic name it once had. It was Mailbox Mayhem Lane. And if you listen closely, even now, you can almost hear the echoes, the crinkle of envelopes, the scratch of anonymous handwriting, the spark of firecrackers in the night. The war may have ended, but the paranoia never really died. Because in the suburbs, perfection is always a facade. And sometimes, all it takes to shatter it is a single letter.